In January 1992, a cargo ship was crossing the North Pacific Ocean during a brutal winter storm, doing exactly what cargo ships do thousands of times a year, hauling containers from one side of the world to the other, without anyone on land thinking twice about it. Then a wave hit the deck at the wrong angle at the wrong moment, and 12 containers went overboard into the freezing Pacific. 11 of those containers sank without a trace, the way lost cargo almost always does, just gone swallowed by the ocean, never seen again, never even worth investigating. But the 12th container held something that would go on to outperform some of the most expensive scientific equipment ever built by the United States government. Inside that single container were 28,800 bath toys, yellow rubber ducks, blue turtles, green frogs, red beavers, the exact kind of cheap plastic toy you'd throw in a bathtub for a toddler, mass-produced in a factory in China heading toward stores across America. And when that container hit the water and cracked open, it didn't just create an environmental oddity or a weird news story, it accidentally created one of the most valuable scientific datasets in the history of oceanography. One that professional scientists with millions of dollars in equipment had been struggling to replicate for decades. Today we're going to find out exactly how a broken shipping container full of children's bath toys ended up teaching humanity more about how our oceans actually move than almost any single research project in modern history. And I promise you, this is not just a story about rubber ducks. By the time we're done, you're going to hear about millions of Lego pieces still washing up on beaches today, sneakers that solved a decades-old mystery, and why your beach vacation photo might one day become an actual scientific data point without you even realizing it. Here's a question to start with. If I asked you to figure out exactly how ocean currents move, not roughly, not approximately, but precisely, predictably, in a way you could actually use to forecast where something in the water will end up months or years later, how would you even begin to do that? Because here's the problem oceanographers have wrestled with for over a century. The ocean isn't a river with a clear direction. It's this insanely complex system of currents moving at different speeds, different depths, different directions, all influenced by wind, temperature, the rotation of the Earth itself, and seasonal changes that shift the entire pattern throughout the year. You can build the most sophisticated computer model in the world, but a model is just a guess dressed up in mathematics. Until you actually test it against something real happening in the actual ocean, and testing it against something real turns out to be brutally difficult, expensive, and slow, which is exactly the problem that a container full of bath toys accidentally solved. Let's rewind for a second, because to understand why this event became so important, you need to understand what oceanographers were doing before rubber ducks entered the picture, and just how primitive their best tools actually were. For most of the 20th century, tracking ocean currents meant physically dropping something into the water and hoping you'd hear about it again. Scientists used what are called drift bottles, literally glass bottles with a message inside asking whoever found it to record the date and location and mail it back. Thousands of these were released over the decades. The return rate was miserable. Most bottles were never found at all. The ones that were found came back with incomplete, unreliable data, because you had no idea what path the bottle actually took between release and discovery. You only knew the start point and the end point, with a massive unknown gap in between. By the 1970s and 80 seconds, technology improved somewhat. Scientists developed satellite-tracked buoys, devices that could transmit their GPS position in real time as they drifted with ocean currents. This was a massive leap forward, finally real continuous data. But here's the catch that almost nobody outside the field understands: these buoys were expensive. Each one cost thousands of dollars to build and deploy. Governments and universities could only afford to release a limited number of them, which meant scientists were working with a relatively small sample size, spread across an ocean covering over 60 million square miles. Think about that scale for a second. Trying to understand every current, eddy, and seasonal pattern across the entire Pacific Ocean, using maybe a few hundred tracked buoys, is like trying to understand the traffic patterns of an entire country by watching a few dozen cars. So when 28,800 identical, brightly colored, easily identifiable objects got dumped into the middle of that exact ocean completely by accident, oceanographers realized almost immediately that something extraordinary had just landed in their lap. There's one man whose name is inseparable from this entire story: an oceanographer named Curtis Ebesmeyer. And here's something that I think makes this story even better. Ebesmeyer wasn't some random scientist who just happened to notice a news report about lost bath toys. He had actually been tracking flotsam motion debris as a research method for years before this happened. He understood better than almost anyone else on the planet at that time that accidental spills like this weren't just curiosities. They were potentially priceless natural experiments that no research budget could ever replicate on purpose. When Ebbesmeyer heard about the spilled container, he didn't just find it interesting. He immediately understood he was looking at a massive, naturally occurring, professionally impossible to fund experiment. And he needed to start tracking it before the evidence literally washed away and got thrown in the trash by beachcombers who had no idea what they'd found. Here's the first genuinely surprising twist in this story. It took almost a full year before the first ducks started washing ashore, and when they did, they didn't show up somewhere obvious like California or Japan. They started appearing on the beaches of Alaska, specifically near Sitka, roughly 10 months after the spill. Now, why does that matter? Because Ebbesmeyer already had a rough theoretical model in his head of how currents in that part of the Pacific were supposed to behave based on decades of prior research and limited buoy data, and the arrival pattern of these toys where they showed up, and more importantly when they showed up, gave him actual hard data points to test that model against at a scale and density that had simply never existed before. Ebbesmeyer worked with beachcombers, Coast Guard reports, and local newspapers across the Pacific coastline, essentially building an informal but massive citizen science tracking network. He eventually formalized this into something called the Beachcombers Alert, a newsletter he ran specifically to collect and log reports of unusual debris washing up anywhere on the Pacific coast. Every time someone found one of these toys and reported it, that single data point got added to a growing map that was slowly revealing something genuinely valuable. The actual real-world path these ocean currents were taking, not the theoretical path scientists had assumed for decades. Quick question for you. If you found a slightly sun-bleached barnacle-covered rubber duck on a beach right now, what would you do with it? Be honest. Most of us would probably just kick it back into the water or leave it for the seagulls. Thousands of people did exactly that in the early 90s. Before word got out that these things were actually worth reporting, which means the real number of ducks that made landfall is almost certainly higher than what got officially logged. Somewhere out there, there are still unreported ducks sitting quietly in someone's garage, and the person who found it has no idea they were holding a piece of oceanographic history. But here's where the story stops being just a neat curiosity and becomes something with actual verifiable jaw-dropping scientific weight. The ducks didn't just wash up in Alaska and stop there. Over the following years, they kept traveling. Some drifted south along the North American coastline, eventually appearing on beaches in Washington state, Oregon, and California. Others got caught in the massive circular current system that dominates much of the North Pacific, known as the North Pacific Gyre, and made complete loops around it, sometimes taking years to circle back toward where they started, and then things got genuinely bizarre. Some of the toys were eventually swept north into the Arctic Ocean, frozen into pack ice for years at a time, before that ice eventually broke apart and released them into the Atlantic Ocean. From there, some of these original 1992 bath toys began appearing on beaches in the United Kingdom, and reportedly on the eastern coast of the United States, meaning some of these toys had effectively completed a journey that took them across two entirely different oceans over the course of more than a decade. Let that sink in for a second. A children's bath toy manufactured in a Chinese factory, accidentally dumped into the Pacific in 1992, ended up washing ashore in Britain more than 10 years later, having traveled through the Arctic to get there. If you tried to design an experiment on purpose to map that exact multi-ocean current pathway, it would cost you an absolute fortune in tracking buoys, ships, and research grants, and even then most funding agencies would consider it far too ambitious and expensive to actually approve. Here's a question I think is worth sitting with. Do you think anyone at that toy factory in China, or anyone loading that container onto that cargo ship, had even the slightest idea that a shipping accident was about to produce one of the most useful oceanographic datasets of the entire decade? Obviously not. Nobody plans for their bath toys to become scientific instruments. But the ocean doesn't care about your intentions. It just moves things exactly the way physics tells it to. And sometimes, if you're paying close enough attention, that accidental movement teaches you something priceless. So let's talk about why this data was genuinely so valuable. Beyond just being a fun story to tell at dinner parties, ocean current models the mathematical simulations scientists use to predict how water and everything floating in it moves across the planet. Need real-world validation to actually be trustworthy. You can build the most sophisticated model imaginable using satellite data, temperature readings, and wind patterns. But until you compare that model's predictions against something that actually happened in the real ocean, you genuinely don't know how accurate it is. The rubber duck spill gave researchers a rare gift. Thousands of identical objects released from a single known point at a single known time that then scattered across the ocean over more than a decade. That's an almost perfect natural experiment. Scientists were able to take existing computer models of Pacific Ocean currents, specifically one called the ocean surface currents simulation, which had already been in development for years, and directly test its predictions against where the toys were actually reported washing ashore. And here's the genuinely impressive part. The model's predictions turned out to be remarkably accurate. The toys showed up largely where the simulation suggested they should, at roughly the timeframes the simulation predicted. This gave oceanographers something they desperately needed: real-world proof that expensive computer models built on decades of theoretical and satellite data were actually reflecting genuine ocean behavior, not just producing pretty but disconnected mathematical guesses. Think about the actual practical value of that confirmation. These same current models are used for search and rescue operations when ships or planes go down at sea, helping predict where survivors or wreckage might drift. They're used to track oil spills, predicting which coastlines are at risk, and when they're used to understand how plastic pollution moves and accumulates across ocean garbage patches. Every single one of these life and death environmentally critical applications depends on models that needed exactly the kind of real-world validation that a container of bath toys accidentally provided. Now here's a twist that I think most people watching this have absolutely no idea about. This wasn't actually the only major toy spill of its kind, and honestly, once you hear about the others, you start to wonder if the ocean has some kind of sense of humor. Just 2 years earlier in 1990, a separate container overboard incident released roughly 61,000 Nike sneakers into the Pacific Ocean. This one is genuinely fascinating on its own, because unlike bath toys, sneakers are a matched pair. And thanks to serial numbers on individual shoes, researchers and Nike itself were actually able to trace specific shoes back to specific manufacturing batches. Beachcombers along the Pacific Northwest started finding so many washed-up sneakers that a small local trend emerged of people combing beaches specifically looking for wearable pairs, cleaning them up and using them. Some were in good enough condition to actually wear after a wash. Imagine finding a brand new pair of sneakers on the beach and realizing they've been floating across the Pacific Ocean for months before landing at your feet. Then in 1994, nearly 34,000 hockey gloves were lost overboard from a different cargo ship in a very similar incident, and once again scientists tracked their arrival patterns for additional data confirming similar current systems. But the one that I think deserves its own spotlight, because it's genuinely still happening right now as you're watching this video, is the Great Lego Spill of 1997. A cargo ship called the Tokyo Express was hit by a rogue wave off the coast of Cornwall, England, and lost 62 containers overboard. One of those containers held nearly 4.8 million pieces of Lego, and here's the detail that makes this spill genuinely unforgettable. The shipment happened to include a huge number of ocean-themed Lego pieces: tiny plastic octopuses, miniature scuba tanks, little seagrass pieces, spear guns, life rafts. It's almost impossible to make this up. A cargo ship spilled millions of ocean-themed toys into the actual ocean, and unlike the rubber ducks, which eventually became rare collector's items because their numbers were limited, Lego pieces are essentially indestructible. They don't biodegrade in any meaningful time frame. Beachcombers in Cornwall are still finding these exact pieces today, more than 25 years later, washed up on beaches. And there are dedicated online communities and even a published book, specifically tracking where these Lego pieces have been found, cross-referencing locations, to help refine understanding of currents around the British coastline. A marine biologist named Tracy Williams has spent years cataloging these finds, essentially running her own smaller-scale version of exactly what Ebismeyer did with the ducks, except with a toy that will realistically still be washing ashore, long after everyone currently reading this sentence is gone. There's something almost poetic about this if you really think it through. The shipping industry, purely by accident through basic mechanical failures and storm damage that happen thousands of times a year across global cargo routes, ended up contributing more directly to our understanding of ocean current physics than most dedicated research budgets from that same era combined. Let's bring in one more piece of this story because I think it genuinely reframes how you should think about ocean pollution and plastic debris more broadly. The rubber ducks, being made of relatively durable plastic, didn't just wash ashore and disappear. Many of them are quite literally still floating in the ocean today. Over 3 decades after that container broke open, some of the original ducks and turtles from this exact 1992 spill have been recovered and sold to collectors for hundreds of dollars. Treated almost like scientific artifacts rather than children's bath toys, precisely because of the historic role they played in this research. There's a strange little market out there where a faded barnacle-scarred rubber duck can be worth more than a brand new one still in its factory packaging, simply because of where it's been. But here's the darker side of this story that I think deserves genuine attention. These same durable plastic properties that made the ducks and the Lego pieces useful as long-term scientific tracers are exactly the properties that make plastic pollution such a devastating permanent problem for our oceans. A rubber duck that survives 30 years of ocean travel is a fascinating scientific curiosity, a microplastic particle that survives hundreds of years, slowly breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces that marine life mistakes for food, is an entirely different kind of story. One without a neat, satisfying scientific silver lining. So in a strange way, this single incident represents both sides of humanity's complicated relationship with plastic in the ocean simultaneously. On one hand, an accidental spill that genuinely advanced scientific understanding in ways that saved money, improved safety predictions, and validated critical research models. On the other hand, a permanent reminder that everything we accidentally release into the ocean, no matter how small or seemingly harmless, tends to stick around for a very, very long time, and the ocean rarely gives us a say in where it ends up or what it eventually harms along the way. This connects directly to something you've probably heard of but maybe never fully understood: the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Most people picture this as a solid floating island of trash you could practically walk across, which honestly makes for a dramatic mental image but isn't quite accurate. It's actually a massive diffuse region of the North Pacific Gyre, the exact same current system that carried our rubber ducks around for years, where floating debris, much of it broken down into tiny fragments, accumulates because of the circular motion of the current strapping it in place. The same gyre physics that gave scientists a free oceanographic tracking experiment with 28,800 toys is the exact same mechanism slowly concentrating millions of tons of plastic waste into one of the most studied and most troubling accumulation zones on the planet. Modern researchers studying that garbage patch and the broader crisis of ocean plastic pollution still reference current models validated by incidents exactly like this rubber duck spill as part of their foundational understanding of how debris accumulates and moves across these gyres over time. Every satellite image you've ever seen estimating the size and movement of that garbage patch relies in part on modeling techniques that were stress-tested, using exactly the kind of accidental real-world data this story is built around. Let's bring this story full circle, because I think the ending here is genuinely satisfying in a way that a lot of accidental discoveries in science never quite manage to be. Curtis Ebbesmeyer's work tracking these toys didn't just end as a fun anecdote buried in an academic journal somewhere. His research became foundational enough that he continued studying ocean debris and drift patterns for decades afterward, eventually co-authoring a book about it and becoming one of the most frequently cited experts whenever a major spill or unusual debris pattern makes international news. Every time you hear a news story about mysterious debris washing up somewhere unexpected, there's a very good chance the scientific framework being used to explain it traces directly back to lessons learned from this exact 1992 incident, and the applications keep expanding even now, well beyond anything Ebbesmeyer could have imagined when he first started logging beachcomber reports by mail. Modern oceanographers now incorporate crowdsourced data from apps and citizen science platforms. Specifically designed around the same principle, these toys accidentally proved that thousands of small individually reported data points gathered from ordinary people walking on ordinary beaches can outperform expensive dedicated equipment when you have enough of them spread across a large enough area and a long enough time frame. So here's the full picture brought together. A cargo ship doing exactly what tens of thousands of cargo ships do every single year. Lost a container in a storm. That container held nothing more significant than cheap plastic bath toys. And through pure accident, that spill provided a level of real-world, large-scale, long-term oceanographic data that professional research institutions with genuine multi-million-dollar budgets had been struggling to replicate through deliberate planned experiments for decades. It's honestly one of the best examples in modern science of something researchers call a natural experiment, a situation where the real world accidentally creates the exact conditions scientists need to test a theory without anyone planning it, funding it, or even wanting it to happen in the first place. Nobody at that toy factory got a bonus for advancing oceanography. Nobody on that cargo ship's insurance claim mentioned accidental scientific contribution as a silver lining. And yet here we are more than 3 decades later still talking about it. The next time you're giving a rubber duck to a kid at bath time, or you spot a stray Lego brick wedged between 2 rocks on some random beach. I want you to actually think about this story for a second, because somewhere out there floating in the North Pacific or the Arctic, or possibly even washed up on a random beach in Scotland or Cornwall right now, there might genuinely still be a handful of the original 28,800 ducks, or a tiny plastic octopus from that 1997 Lego spill. Quietly continuing a scientific journey that nobody ever intended to start, that ended up teaching us more about how our oceans move than almost anything else in modern history. Sometimes the biggest scientific breakthroughs don't come from a lab, sometimes they come from a broken shipping container, a bad storm, and a scientist smart enough to realize that an accident was actually a gift. If this completely changed the way you'll look at a rubber duck, or honestly the next time you step on a Lego brick in bare feet, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe to Valnor, because there's a lot more hiding in the ocean and in the machines that move across it than most people ever stop to think about, and we're just getting started. I'll see you in the next one.